It was almost closing time. The store was quiet, and I was just finishing up some cleaning when I saw her shuffle in. She looked out of place, frail, hunched over, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast deep shadows over her face. 9:45 p.m., and no one else around. I plastered on my customer service smile and greeted her, but she didn't respond, just stared at me for a moment before ordering a black coffee. As I started preparing it, she suddenly rasped, "No, make it a bone latte instead." I froze. Bone latte? I thought I'd misheard. Excuse me? Her gaze sharpened. "You're supposed to make it just for me." A chill ran down my spine. My hands shook as I made a regular latte, hoping it would satisfy her. When I handed it over, she leaned closer, her eyes, small, pale, and unblinking, fixed on mine. "It's wrong," she whispered, a hint of anger in her tone. She turned and left without another word, disappearing into the dark parking lot. When I told my manager, he just brushed it off, saying she was probably confused. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The first time she came back, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But by the third night, I knew it wasn't. She'd shuffle in just before 10 p.m., always in that same wide-brimmed hat, face half hidden, and always asking for the same thing, a bone latte. Each time I'd refuse, offering her a regular drink instead. But with every visit, her glare grew colder, her words sharper. "You know what I want," she'd hiss, her eyes never leaving mine. I felt my nerves unravel a little more each night. My manager, Mike, still shrugged it off. "Just ignore her," he said. Easy for him to say. He left before closing. I was the one left alone to deal with her lingering presence, those eyes that seemed to bore into me even after she walked out. I started dreading my shifts, always looking over my shoulder, counting down the minutes to closing. On the fifth night, it got worse. This time, when I told her I couldn't make a bone latte, she didn't argue. Instead, she pulled something from her coat pocket and slammed it onto the counter. It was a small, broken piece of bone, marred and stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. My throat tightened as she leaned in, her breath hot and sour. "This is the main ingredient," she whispered. I staggered back, heart pounding in my chest. "No, I'm not making you anything," I stammered, her face twisted with rage. She snatched up the bone, muttering something low and guttural that I couldn't make out, and then she was gone, storming out the door and vanishing into the night. But I could see her silhouette through the windows, standing just beyond the light, watching. I couldn't move until she disappeared completely. Now, I dread every closing shift, feeling her gaze on me even when she's not there. That night, I was desperate to finish closing up and get out. The place felt colder, the shadows deeper. I moved quickly, wiping down counters, sweeping the floor, anything to keep my mind off her. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The sound was soft, rhythmic, like fingernails gently tapping against glass. Slowly, I turned toward the cafe windows. There she was, standing at the far end of the parking lot, just on the edge of the streetlight's glow. Her form was hunched, hat brim low over her face, and she was utterly still. My mouth went dry. She didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood there watching. I didn't wait to see if she'd do anything else. I bolted, locking the doors with trembling hands and getting out as fast as I could. Even as I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the empty street. The next morning, I almost didn't come in, but curiosity and a nagging sense of dread pushed me to check on the place. I barely made it through the door when I saw my manager pacing, his face pale. "Kevin, did you see this?" he asked, gesturing wildly toward the fridge. I looked inside and felt my stomach drop. Every single milk jug was filled with a thick, dark liquid. It glistened under the fluorescent lights, sickly and dense. We called the police and they took samples. A few hours later, one of the officers pulled us aside, his face grim. "We tested the substance," he said. It's got traces of human DNA." I staggered back, nausea roiling in my gut. Human DNA. Couldn't breathe. I quit on the spot, barely even looking at Mike as I stumbled out of the cafe. Because one thought kept clawing at my mind. What would have happened if I'd made that bone latte for her? Months went by, and I tried to forget. But one day, a friend who still worked at the Starbucks called me, sounding shaken. "Kevin, it's happening at other stores. That woman, she's been showing up again." My heart clenched. He went on to say that she'd appeared in 2 other Starbucks locations nearby, always right before closing, always asking for the same thing, a bone latte. And in each case, a young male barista had gone missing shortly after. I hung up and started digging online, my hands trembling. News articles confirmed my worst fears. Every barista who served her had vanished without a trace. My stomach turned as I scrolled through photos of the missing, faces that could have easily been mine. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I stared at it, dread coiling tight around my chest. But I answered anyway. There was a brief pause, and then a familiar, rasping voice spoke, low and mocking. "You were supposed to make it. Just for me." The line went dead. I stood there, shaking, listening to the echo of her words in the silence, my heart pounding louder than ever.
The night shift at the 24-hour Starbucks isn't for everyone, but I've grown to like it. There's something calming about the emptiness of the cafe, the hum of the espresso machine, and the way the city outside seems to hold its breath. It's just me, the soft glow of the streetlights, and the occasional straggler wandering by. Most nights, I only serve a couple of customers, mostly students cramming for exams or tired truckers needing a quick pick-me-up. But lately I've noticed someone new, someone different. Started about a week ago. Around 2 a.m., I spotted a man standing outside, just beyond the halo of the street lamp. He didn't look homeless or drunk, just out of place. He never came in, just stood there, staring through the glass as if trying to memorize every inch of the place. First, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just a curious passerby. But he's been showing up more frequently. He lingers longer each time, his eyes following me as I move around. It's unsettling, but I keep telling myself he's just another random night owl. Still, there's something about him that makes my skin crawl. It was a miserable night. Cold, with rain hammering against the windows in steady, relentless sheets. I was alone as usual, trying to keep warm behind the counter when I noticed him again. This time, instead of lingering outside, he was standing at the entrance, his face half lit by the flickering street lamp. My heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, I looked down, pretending I hadn't seen him, praying he'd move on. But when I glanced up again, he was inside. He hadn't made a sound coming in, no bell chime, nothing. He was just there, right in front of the counter, soaking wet, staring at me. His clothes were drenched, water pooling on the floor beneath him, but he didn't seem to notice. I forced a smile, even though my hands were trembling. Can I help you?" I managed to say, my voice barely steady. He didn't respond. He just kept staring, unblinking, his eyes dark and empty. Minutes seemed to stretch out forever. I swallowed hard and tried again. "Do you want something to drink?" Still nothing, just that blank, unnerving gaze. Then slowly he leaned in, his lips parting in a crooked smile. "I'm waiting," he whispered, his voice soft, almost gentle. I couldn't breathe. Waiting for what? I opened my mouth to ask, but no words came out. Panicked, I turned and hurried into the back room, desperate for a moment to collect myself. Just a few seconds, I thought. When I stepped back out, he was gone. The only sign he'd been there was the puddle of rainwater by the counter. Heart racing, I locked the door and peered outside. That's when I saw him, across the street, standing perfectly still in the rain. His face twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. He didn't move. He just stared, that eerie smile etched onto his face. I backed away from the window, my skin crawling. I didn't sleep at all that morning. After that night, he started showing up more often. It wasn't every night, but enough that I never felt at ease anymore. Sometimes he'd be standing just outside the window, his face inches from the glass, watching me with that same blank stare. Other nights, I'd catch glimpses of him farther away, a dark silhouette lurking in the shadows across the street. He'd stay for hours unmoving, just watching. Then, when my shift ended and I'd step outside, he'd be gone, as if he'd never been there at all. I tried calling the police a few times. Each time they'd arrive, shining their flashlights into the dark corners and around the building, but they never found anyone. "Probably just a local weirdo," one officer told me, shrugging. "If he's not breaking any laws, there's not much we can do." They told me to call again if I felt threatened, but their words were empty. They didn't see his eyes. They didn't see that smile. I was starting to think maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just some harmless creep. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even on my days off, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there, grinning. And then one night he wasn't there at all. For the first time in weeks, my shift passed quietly. No dark figure outside. No eyes tracking my every move. I should have felt relieved, but instead my anxiety only deepened. Was it over? Or was he planning something? I tried to push the thoughts away, but my nerves were shot. As I closed up, I glanced around the cafe one last time. That's when I saw it. A napkin lying on the counter where I'd been working earlier. I frowned, picking it up. The ink was smeared and blotchy, but I could still make out the words, scratched messily in the center. My home address. I dropped it, my heart hammering in my chest. He knew where I lived. I packed up and left within a week. I couldn't stay. Not after he proved he could find me outside of work. I quit my job at Starbucks, moved to a different city, and tried to forget about that unsettling visitor. Slowly, things returned to normal. My new job was similar. Another cafe, but this one felt safer, warmer. No dark windows. No shadows outside. I almost started to believe I'd left it all behind. Months passed without incident, and I began to relax. I didn't look over my shoulder anymore. The nightmares faded. Then, one evening, as I scrolled through my phone on a quiet shift, a headline caught my eye. String of barista disappearances linked to night shift stalker. My stomach dropped as I read on. All young women. All working late shifts in cafes. One of them was from my old Starbucks. But it was the most recent victim that made my blood run cold. A girl from this cafe. She disappeared just days before I started my job. And when I looked up, I could have sworn just for a moment I saw a familiar silhouette outside watching. Working the morning shift at Starbucks has a rhythm to it. There's something almost comforting about the routine. I know every regular by name, order, and the exact moment they'll step through the door. Among them is one of my favorites. A sharply dressed man, mid-30s, always showing up at exactly 8 a.m. He orders a caramel macchiato, no foam. He's never in a rush, always smiling warmly, and always tips more than he needs to. For months, he's been a constant in the chaos of the morning rush, a familiar face that blended into the routine. But lately, I've been seeing him at times he shouldn't be there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he's working late or his schedule changed. But he started appearing during lunch, at the end of my afternoon shift, and even just before closing when I'm almost alone. Every time I glance up from the register, his eyes are already on me. He's not staring exactly. It's just that his gaze lingers a little too long, and there's something unsettling in the way he watches me. It's like I'm part of his routine now, not the other way around. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he works nearby, I thought. I mean, it's Manhattan, people are always rushing around, right? But then I started seeing him outside of work. Once, I spotted him standing across the street as I left my apartment building in the morning. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there looking in my direction. I brushed it off, tried to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I mean, it's not like he's following me, right? But then it started happening more often. I'd catch a glimpse of him in the crowd when I ran errands, or see him lingering at the back of the cafe when I took my break. He'd just be there, watching, always watching. One evening, when my shift ran late and most of the mall had emptied out, I saw him again. He was standing by the employee exit, leaning casually against the wall like he'd been waiting for me the entire time. My heart was pounding as I pushed the door open. "Why are you always around?" I demanded, my voice wavering. He didn't move, didn't even blink, just tilted his head slightly and smiled that same calm, unsettling smile. "You'll see," he murmured softly, and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the empty parking lot. I reported it to mall security the next day, hoping they'd take me seriously, but they just shrugged. "He's not doing anything illegal," they said. "If he hasn't made a move, there's nothing we can do." I left feeling exposed, vulnerable, and very, very alone. It's been days now, and that sense of being watched hasn't gone away. I know his presence isn't random anymore. It's deliberate, planned, and no one believes me. It was almost midnight when my phone rang. I'd been curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with some mindless TV. The only sound in my apartment, the low hum of the show's dialogue. The sudden, shrill ring made me jump. Frowning, I glanced at the screen. Blocked number. I hesitated, but then, against every instinct, I swiped to answer. "Hello." For a moment, there was only silence. I almost hung up. Then I heard it. A low, measured voice, chillingly calm. "Check your shift schedule." The voice sent a bolt of ice through my chest. I knew that voice. It was so familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. My mind raced. "Who is this?" I whispered, but the line was already dead. My hands were trembling as I grabbed my planner from the kitchen counter. I flipped through the pages, heart hammering in my ears, until I reached the current week. And then I saw it. Tiny symbols, Strange, almost hieroglyphic shapes were drawn beside each of the shifts I'd been covering for Jenny, the barista who'd been out sick. I hadn't written them. No one else had access to my planner. But there they were, marking every time I'd been scheduled to work in her place. I felt my breath hitch. How did he know? I stumbled back, gripping the planner tightly. The realization washed over me like ice water. He hadn't just been showing up by chance. He'd known my every move, knew exactly when I'd be there. He was tracking me, planning his visits down to the minute. Panic surged through me as I called mall security again, voice shaking. But they brushed me off as usual. "It's probably just a prank, ma'am," they said. "Maybe a friend messing with you." Friend. My thoughts spun. No, this wasn't a prank. This was something far more sinister. I'm not paranoid. I'm not imagining things. But no one will listen, and every time I glance around, I feel that same unnerving presence. He's out there. And I don't know what he wants. I couldn't keep living like this, waiting, wondering what he wanted. So I took everything to the police and mall security. The planner, the creepy symbols, the call logs. I expected them to brush me off again, but something shifted in their expressions as I laid out the evidence. We devised a plan. I'd work as usual, pretending everything was normal, while they kept the cafe under close surveillance. The next night, just before closing, he walked in. That same suit, that same smile. But tonight, his gaze was different. Darker, sharper, like he was savoring the moment. My pulse raced as I locked up and stepped outside. I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. And then suddenly there was chaos. Shouting, flashing lights. Security and police swarmed him before he could react. They found a small knife hidden under his coat. I didn't want to look, but one of the officers turned it over, revealing the blade etched with those same eerie symbols from my planner. "He's been wanted for years," one officer murmured. "Always targeting young baristas. Disappearing just before they did. They took him away, but the fear hasn't left me. Even at my new location, I still feel those eyes on me sometimes, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting."